Before the first Sherman tanks ever rolled into battle, the German High Command and its soldiers were steeped in propaganda that painted a flattering, almost invincible portrait of their own armored forces. The Panzers were celebrated as the unstoppable spearhead of blitzkrieg, sleek machines that had torn through Poland and France with terrifying speed. Nazi propaganda films and newsreels showed them smashing through weak defenses, their silhouettes becoming symbols of a new kind of warfare. Inside Germany, the message was clear. No one, least of all the Americans, could compete with the experience, discipline, and technological edge of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions. Against this backdrop, American tanks were ridiculed. German soldiers were told that the Americans built cheap machines in quantity, crude and unsophisticated compared to the refined engineering of a Panzer IV or a Tiger. Cartoons mocked American armor as lumbering toys that would collapse under the first shell. In taverns and barracks, officers repeated the claim that the United States was a nation of factory workers, not warriors. Their machines might be numerous, but they would lack the quality and the steel to stand up to German might. This arrogance filtered down to the front line. Luftwaffe pilots laughed about flying barns and tank crews sneered at the thought of American industry challenging the craftsmanship of Germany's factories. The myth of German superiority was not just about machines. It was about national identity. To the average German soldier, the war was proof that discipline, order, and German blood guaranteed victory. The Allies, especially Americans, were seen as soft, distracted by comfort and wealth, incapable of true sacrifice. It was a myth that would be shattered not in one decisive moment, but slowly, painfully, as Germans confronted realities they had never imagined. Among them, Shermans equipped with radios that gave ordinary American crews an edge they could not explain. The arrogance was not built on propaganda alone, it was reinforced by years of stunning victories. From 1939 through 1942, German armored divisions cut through Europe with an efficiency that seemed unstoppable. In Poland, tanks worked seamlessly with Stuka dive bombers to overwhelm defenses in weeks. In France, panzer columns bypassed the Maginot Line and rolled into Paris in little more than a month, humiliating one of Europe's proudest armies. Each triumph fed the belief that German engineering and tactics were unmatched, while their enemies were clumsy and outdated. The Balkans campaign in 1941 only deepened this confidence. German armor crushed Yugoslavia and Greece in weeks, reinforcing the idea that no terrain and no opposition could halt the panzer spearhead. Even in Russia, where distances were vast and resistance fierce, the first months of Operation Barbarossa gave German troops the illusion that their armored divisions were unstoppable. Soviet tanks were destroyed in their hundreds, and German officers grew convinced that nothing could stand against the precision and discipline of their combined arms warfare. These victories hardened a worldview. German soldiers believed that the Wehrmacht's superiority was not just tactical but inevitable. When news of American mobilization reached them, it was dismissed as irrelevant. How could a nation that had not fought a continental war in decades possibly challenge a force that had marched from Warsaw to Athens, to the gates of Moscow? In the minds of many Germans, the war was proof that discipline and machinery born of German genius could not be equal. That certainty would blind them to the hidden strengths of their enemy, including an advantage they could not yet see: the radios humming quietly inside every American tank. When the M4 Sherman first appeared on the battlefield, German soldiers and officers saw little reason to be impressed. To them, it was a squat, boxy machine, lacking the sleek lines and heavy armor of the Panzer IV or the intimidating bulk of the Tiger. Nicknamed the Ronson by some Allied crews because of its tendency to ignite when struck, the Sherman quickly earned a reputation among Germans as a second-rate tank, proof that the Americans were building in haste and with little regard for quality. On the fields of North Africa, where Shermans first clashed with Rommel's Afrika Korps, German crews judged them as clumsy and undergunned. A Tiger's 88mm cannon could destroy a Sherman long before the American tank closed to effective range, and even the Panzer IV often enjoyed an edge in firepower and armor. Propaganda reports emphasized these mismatches, feeding the narrative that the Sherman was nothing more than a mass-produced toy, a product of factories rather than ingenuity. To the Germans, the Sherman was another confirmation of what they already believed, that America relied on quantity over quality, and that no amount of tanks could overcome German skill and design. In taverns and barracks, stories circulated of Shermans bursting into flames under German shells, fueling laughter and dismissive pride. What no one realized, however, was that the Sherman's strength was never meant to lie in individual duels. Its advantage would come not from thicker armor or a bigger gun, but from something far less visible: the quiet crackle of radios linking each crew to the larger war machine. It was an edge the Germans dismissed until it was too late. In the deserts of North Africa, where visibility stretched for miles and tank duels were decided at long range, German crews quickly came to see the Sherman as little more than a nuisance. To them, the pattern seemed predictable. Shermans advanced in numbers, only to be knocked out by fewer but superior German panzers. The Tiger, with its devastating 88mm cannon, made short work of them, while even the seasoned Panzer IV could destroy a Sherman before it closed the gap. Reports circulated within Rommel's Afrika Korps that the American tank was sluggish in sand, mechanically inferior to German designs, and prone to bursting into flames when struck. These tales traveled fast, reinforcing the belief that the Sherman was simply another example of American excess, mass production, without substance. German officers dismissed it as a crude attempt to imitate European engineering, while soldiers scoffed at its boxy silhouette and narrow tracks. The dismissiveness was not without confidence behind it. German crews had years of battlefield experience, and relied on the aura of invincibility built up by blitzkrieg victories. To them, the Shermans posed no real threat. If anything, their presence confirmed the superiority of German skill. It was easy to laugh when Shermans burned on the desert floor, their wrecks left behind as evidence of German dominance. But what Germans could not see was the learning curve happening behind the scene. American crews adapted, tactics shifted, and the very radios that linked Shermans together were already rewriting the rhythm of armored warfare. The arrogance of dismissing the Sherman as an inferior machine blinded German troops to the quiet edge that would soon transform the battlefield. When the fighting shifted from North Africa to Europe, German confidence in their own superiority faced a new and unsettling sight: endless rows of Shermans. Unlike the sporadic encounters in the desert, the invasion of Italy and later the landings in Normandy revealed something different. The Shermans did not come as a handful of undergunned tanks. They came as waves, rolling off ships, unloaded at ports, and advancing through countryside and cities in columns that seemed to have no end. German soldiers who had once laughed at the Sherman's boxy frame began whispering about its sheer numbers. Every road seemed to rumble with their engines. Every village captured by the Allies had Shermans at its spearhead. Even when one tank was knocked out, another 2 or 3 seemed to take its place within hours. To frontline troops, it was a disorienting experience. The battlefield, once dominated by panzers operating as the fist of blitzkrieg, was now crowded with American tanks moving in coordinated units, their radios crackling orders from one to another. The psychological effect was profound. German tank crews began to feel isolated, their own numbers dwindling, their machines harder to replace. Factories back home struggled under Allied bombing raids, while the Americans seemed to have an endless supply line stretching back across the Atlantic. The Germans could still destroy Shermans in single duels, but increasingly those victories felt hollow. For every burning wreck, more arrived, and with them came artillery, aircraft and infantry moving in lockstep. The illusion of German superiority began to fray. What had once been dismissed as an inferior machine now loomed as a symbol of American industrial might, a machine that refused to disappear, no matter how many were destroyed. For German officers, the most unsettling observation was not the Sherman itself, but how effortlessly the Americans replaced them. In North Africa, they had grown accustomed to wreck-strewn fields, where destroyed Shermans were left to smolder. In Europe, however, the pattern was different. A tank destroyed one day seemed to be replaced by 2 more the next. Rail lines and ports funneled an endless stream of new machines to the front, while workshops repaired damaged Shermans with remarkable speed. Reports began filtering up the chain of command, describing a battlefield that never thinned out. American armored units absorbed losses without hesitation, regrouping and pressing forward with fresh tanks and rested crews. To German officers, This rhythm was unnerving. Their own panzers were irreplaceable treasures. Every destroyed Tiger or Panther was a blow that could take months to mend. But to the Americans, Sherman seemed almost disposable, an expendable resource sustained by factories that never stopped working. This difference struck at the heart of German morale. Even as they scored tactical victories, officers privately admitted a growing sense of futility. What value was there in knocking out 10 Shermans if 20 more rolled into the line the next morning? The battlefield was no longer about the duel of machines, but about a war economy tilting heavily in America's favor. What the Germans did not yet realize was that the radios inside those Shermans multiplied this advantage even further. Replacement tanks didn't just fill gaps, they seamlessly joined a network that made the Allied advance relentless. To the German eye, the Sherman was a simple machine, lightly armored, mass-produced, and inferior in direct combat to their own prized Panzer. But what most German crews never suspected was that the Sherman carried a secret weapon hidden not in its gun or armor, but in its voice. Each tank rolled onto the battlefield with a radio set that connected it to every other Sherman, to infantry units, to artillery batteries, and even to aircraft overhead. In an era when many German tanks still relied on hand signals, flags, or dispatch riders to communicate, the Americans had created a web of constant coordination. A Sherman commander did not have to guess where his allies were. He could hear them direct. Orders, warnings, and target sightings traveled instantly across frequencies, allowing entire formations to shift direction or concentrate fire in seconds. To German troops accustomed to rigid command structures and delays in relaying information, this fluidity seemed uncanny. The radios transformed the Sherman from a vulnerable machine into part of a living organism. One tank knocked out mattered little if the others immediately adjusted to cover the gap. Ambushes failed because reinforcements could be called in without hesitation. Artillery strikes arrived on target within minutes of a Sherman spotting an enemy position. For American crews, this invisible thread of communication provided confidence. For German observers, it was a mystery why the Shermans seemed to move with such seamless purpose. The advantage was not in a thicker plate of armor or a bigger gun, but in a battlefield intelligence system that allowed average tanks to outmaneuver elite machines. The Germans had mocked the Sherman's shape, but they never understood the power humming quietly inside its wall. For German troops on the ground, the way American tanks moved often seemed unnatural. In ambushes, they expected confusion, the usual panic of armored units caught off guard. Instead, Shermans reacted with uncanny speed. One tank would swing its turret to suppress the ambushes, while others maneuvered to flank, and infantry closed in with coordinated precision. To the Germans it looked rehearsed, as though every American tank commander could read the thoughts of his comrade. Officers began reporting with frustration that Shermans fought as though linked by an invisible thread. A lone Panther or Tiger might destroy one or two, but then the others closed in like a pack, calling in artillery or aircraft to finish the job. German doctoring relied on the individual prowess of their machines and crews. American doctoring relied on communication, and communication, thanks to radios in every Sherman, turned the battlefield into a chessboard where the Americans always seemed one move ahead. The puzzle gnawed at German minds. How could tanks that were smaller, weaker, and supposedly inferior keep outmaneuvering them? Captured American manuals and equipment slowly revealed the answer: radios as standard equipment, not luxury. To German soldiers who often relied on a single command tank with a radio, it was staggering. Every Sherman, even the most basic model, was a command post on tracks. The realization shook the core of their confidence. The Americans had built not just tanks but a system, one where no unit was truly alone, and no decision was delayed. What looked like clumsy machines on the surface were in truth part of a coordinated storm. What made the Sherman truly fearsome was not its cannon alone, but its ability to summon entire branches of the Allied war machine with the turn of a dial. Inside every tank sat a radio set powerful enough to link directly with artillery batteries, infantry companies, and even aircraft circling above. A Sherman commander did not simply fight with the tools on his vehicle, he carried the ability to call in thunder from miles away. German crews learned this lesson the hard way. A concealed position that might have remained undiscovered for hours against slower-moving enemies could be identified and obliterated within minutes once a Sherman spotted it. The tank commander would radio coordinates to nearby artillery, and within moments shells rained down with unnerving accuracy. Entire ambush sites were reduced to smoking craters before the Germans could even withdraw. Air power too became part of the Sherman's extended reach. Allied fighter bombers flying close support missions often orbited in coordination with tank formations. A quick radio transmission transformed an air patrol into a precision strike, strafing convoys or blasting dug-in defenses. For German troops accustomed to laborious chains of command, the speed of these responses seemed impossible. Even routine coordination was revolutionized. Shermans could advance in sync with infantry, redirect supply trucks, or shift formations in real time. No longer did battlefield friction slow the Americans. Communication erased hesitation and turned chaos into rhythm. For the Germans, this dominance was deeply unsettling. Their own panzers might carry radios, but rarely did every tank in a platoon have one, and infantry coordination often lagged behind. By contrast, every Sherman was a node in a vast network, extending American firepower far beyond what its armor or guns suggested. It was not simply a tank, it was a command center on tracks. While American crews relied on crisp voices over radio channels, many German tank units were still trapped in the habits of an earlier war. A single command tank might be fitted with a radio, but the rest of the platoon depended on hand signals, colored flags, or dispatch riders weaving dangerously between vehicles. In training grounds, these methods seemed workable. In the smoke and noise of real battle, they collapsed into chaos. Imagine the scene: shells bursting, machine gun fire rattling, dust and smoke choking the air. A commander waving a flag from his hatch could scarcely be seen, much less understood. Orders were delayed, misunderstood, or lost entirely. In those moments of confusion, American Shermans, guided by constant radio chatter, shifted with a precision that felt almost supernatural to German observers. One unit could lay down suppressing fire while another maneuvered to encircle, their movements coordinated in real time. The contrast could not have been sharper. German efficiency, so feared in the early years of the war, faltered when silence and delay crept into the battlefield. American flexibility thrived in the very chaos where German methods broke down. And as the Shermans grew bolder, calling in artillery or aircraft at a moment's notice, German crews found themselves outpaced not just by numbers, but by communication itself. To the Germans, it seemed as though every Sherman commander had a general whispering in his ear. In reality, it was the simple power of widespread radios, a quiet revolution that turned ordinary tanks into instruments of synchronized destruction. What stunned German observers even more than Sherman radios was the discovery that this technology was not confined to tanks. It was everywhere. American jeeps carried radios to relay reconnaissance. Trucks hauling fuel and ammunition stayed in constant contact with forward units. Even supply depots and maintenance crews, far behind the front, were tied into the same web of communication. To German soldiers, this seemed an extravagance bordering on madness. Radios in a simple transport truck. To them, such equipment was rare, expensive, and usually reserved for command vehicles. Yet the Americans treated it as ordinary, as basic as a rifle or a pair of boots. Every link in the chain, from the smallest jeep to the largest armored column, could speak to the others. That meant reinforcements arrived precisely when needed, convoys diverted around danger, and resupply flowed without interruption. German supply lines, by contrast, often relied on couriers or vulnerable telephone lines strung across occupied territory. A single cut cable or an ambushed messenger could paralyze an entire unit. The Americans had no such weakness. With radios humming at every level, their armies moved with an efficiency that felt impossible to an enemy conditioned by scarcity. For the POWs, the shock was not just technical but cultural. The sheer ordinariness of radios in America reflected a nation so wealthy and industrially advanced that luxuries elsewhere were everyday tools here. In German eyes, this was the most crushing contrast of all. The United States was not merely fighting with tanks and guns, but with invisible threads of communication that knit the entire army into a living, breathing organism. For German officers who had once viewed a radio as a prized piece of equipment, The casual way Americans treated them was almost unthinkable. In the Wehrmacht, radios were guarded, scarce, and often concentrated in command vehicles. A single set could determine whether a platoon stayed informed or fought blind. Many tanks still relied on hand signals or runners, a method that belonged to another era. But in America, radios were not luxuries. They were standard. Every Sherman had one. Every Jeep had one. Every supply truck and reconnaissance car seemed wired into the same endless network. To the Germans, this was a revelation of how wealth and mass production shaped war. What they considered elite technology, Americans considered basic issues. This realization carried a deeper sting. It revealed that America's strength was not only in numbers, but in the assumption of abundance. Radios were so common that no one treated them with awe. They were tools, used daily, expected to work, replaced if broken. The German POWs could only imagine what that meant for other areas of American life. If radios were everywhere, what else did the United States take for granted? The contrast exposed the fragility of Germany's wartime illusion. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as soft and technologically behind, yet here was proof of the opposite. The ordinary soldier in the US Army fought with equipment that seemed extraordinary by European standards. In those moments, German prisoners realized they had underestimated not just a machine or an army, but an entire way of life. German soldiers who faced the Sherman often spoke later of an eerie sense that the Americans were anticipating their every move. It was not that the Sherman was faster or deadlier than a Panther or Tiger in a head-to-head duel. What stunned them was how the Americans seemed to act as one body, shifting and striking with uncanny precision. Stories spread among German units of ambushes where a column of Shermans would fan out, flank, and cut off escape routes almost before the first shot was fired. The secret, though invisible to those under fire, was the radio. While German tankers wrestled with shouted orders or frantic hand gestures, every American tank commander carried a headset and microphone. A single warning about enemy armor could ripple instantly across the formation, prompting Shermans on the far end of the line to swing wide and close the trap. To Germans caught in these maneuvers, it felt less like fighting machines, and more like being hunted by a pack of predators. Eyewitness accounts described how a German tank crew might fire at one Sherman, only to find two more sliding in from the sides, already in position to fire. The speed of the response defied the old rhythm of armored warfare. Where Germans expected confusion, they found coordination. Where they hoped for a gap, they met overlapping fields of fire. For the prisoners who later recalled these battles, the realization was crushing. The Shermans did not win simply because they existed in greater numbers. They won because they were never alone. Behind each one was a voice, a network, and a unity of purpose that turned individual tanks into pieces of a far greater whole. For German tankers and infantry, the most unnerving discovery was not the Sherman's armor or gun, but the speed of the American response. A single skirmish might begin with a German gun knocking out a Sherman at long range. In past campaigns, such a hit would scatter enemy armor and buy time for a retreat. But against the Americans, within moments, fresh Shermans seemed to appear from the flanks, already maneuvering into position as if they had been waiting for the signal. Prisoners later admitted that it felt as though the Americans had invisible eyes across the battlefield. A German ambush, carefully prepared, could unravel within minutes once the first shot was fired. Supply trucks would reroute before they could be interdicted. Infantry support would arrive just as German positions pressed their advantage. Even artillery seemed to answer with uncanny timing, called in from beyond the horizon. What Germans slowly grasped was that these reactions were not coincidence, but coordination. Radios allowed American units to act as one, compressing the time between decision and action to seconds rather than hours. For an army trained on strict hierarchy and rigid chains of command, this fluidity was baffling. To their eyes, it seemed the Americans had abandoned order for chaos, yet in truth, it was a different kind of order, one built on communication, speed, and trust in technology. By the time the realization spread among captured troops, the damage was already done. They had underestimated, not just the Sherman, but the invisible system that turned its crews into a force far more dangerous than propaganda had ever suggested. Among captured German tank crews, one refrain appeared again and again: firepower was not enough. They had gone into battle confident that their Panthers and Tigers would tear through the lighter Shermans, and often they did in the opening moments. Reports told of Shermans knocked out in smoking wrecks, their armor pierced with ease. Yet even in those moments of triumph, a gnawing frustration grew. The battle never seemed to end with the first kills. Instead, new Shermans rolled forward, maneuvering faster, flanking harder, and striking with uncanny time. For German crews trained to believe in technical superiority, this was maddening. They could fire accurately, hit first, even destroy multiple opponents, but the Americans never seemed to lose cohesion. The radios inside every Sherman meant that even as one tank went up in flames, the rest adjusted instantly. Angles shifted, formations tightened, artillery was summoned, and within minutes, the advantage slipped away. Firepower alone could not overwhelm an enemy who could not be surprised. Prisoners later admitted how demoralizing it became to sit inside tanks designed as beasts of battle, only to feel outmaneuvered by machines they once laughed at. "We hit them but they never broke," one former crewman remarked. Instead, the Shermans kept pressing, coordinated, relentless, like an iron tide. That was the breaking point. The realization that German weapons, for all their engineering, were no longer decisive. Technology without communication was hollow. The frustration of facing an opponent whose strength lay not only in steel but in invisible voices binding them together, cracked the illusion of German dominance, and left tank crews shaken long after the guns fell silent. When German tankers were finally captured and interrogated, one detail surfaced so often that Allied officers were surprised: the radios. It was not just that Shermans had them but that radios seemed to be everywhere. Powers recalled their disbelief as they watched not only tanks but also jeeps, trucks, artillery units, even supply columns constantly speaking to one another through headsets and antennas. For men who had grown up in an army where even tank commanders often shouted orders over roaring engines, this was staggering. Some prisoners admitted their first assumption was that American tanks were guided by some unseen central command post, directing movements like a chessboard. But the truth dawned as they observed more closely. Every crew, every vehicle, every officer had the power to talk directly, to share information instantly. One POW later described it as fighting ghosts that always knew where we were. Testimonies collected after the war show how this revelation shook their confidence. In Germany, radios were limited, often reserved for commanders or the most critical units. In contrast, Americans treated them as standard equipment, a basic tool of war as ordinary as a rifle. To German eyes, this abundance was wasteful, even decadent, until they saw how it translated into crushing effectiveness on the battlefield. Again and again they confessed their shock. The Shermans were never truly alone. Even in defeat, German soldiers admitted that this invisible web of communication had undone them more than any single weapon. Radios had become the Americans' quiet, decisive advantage, and their presence everywhere left German prisoners stunned long after the battles had ended. For many German prisoners, the true scale of what radios meant did not fully register until they were shown footage of D-Day and the campaigns that followed. They had fought at Normandy, felt the thunder of Allied bombardments, and seen the sky filled with aircraft, but from inside a tank or trench, the experience was chaotic, a storm of fire without explanation. Only later, in captivity, did they begin to piece together what made the Allied advance so unstoppable. The films revealed it in stark detail. Sherman tanks rolled forward in precise formations, not blundering blindly into German defenses, but advancing with artillery that struck just ahead of them, softening obstacles. Infantry followed in rhythm, shielded by armor and supported by overhead aircraft. To German eyes, it looked impossibly choreographed, like a machine whose every part moved in harmony. What they came to realize was that this harmony was not luck, it was communication. Prisoners admitted their shock when they learned that every Sherman carried a radio set, that field commanders could call for naval gunfire from miles offshore, and that pilots in the sky could coordinate directly with ground units in real time. One officer remarked that it seemed as though the Allies had discovered a way to collapse the chaos of war into order, compressing hours of planning into minutes of execution. For veterans raised on rigid chains of command and delayed relays of orders, the sight was humbling. Firepower alone had not doomed Germany, nor had numbers alone. It was the seamless coordination of radios linking Sherman artillery and aircraft into a single destructive fist. D-Day, to those who reflected in captivity, was the undeniable proof. Germany had been outfought not just in weapons but in the unseen language of communication. In the days after Normandy, German prisoners no longer argued about the superiority of their machine. The evidence before them was too clear. They had seen tigers and panthers boast thicker armor and heavier guns, yet those advantages melted away when faced with an enemy that fought as one. The Americans had erased the edge of German engineering with something far less glamorous but far more decisive: communication. Captured officers confessed their astonishment at how completely radios nullified their supposed superiority. A Panther might destroy a Sherman in a duel, but while it reloaded or repositioned, another Sherman flanked it, guided by a voice on the radio. Artillery was called in within minutes. Aircraft dove with uncanny timing. What good was thicker armor when an unseen network ensured that every German move was anticipated? Prisoners admitted that this realization was crushing. They had believed for years that German discipline and technology guaranteed victory. Instead, they were forced to accept that the Americans had redefined warfare. Radios had turned the battlefield into something Germans could no longer control: fluid, fast, and merciless. Some described it as watching the ground shift beneath their feet. Others said it felt like a betrayal by their own high command, which had failed to grasp the revolution taking place. But most agreed on one thing: once they understood that American radios had erased their edge, they knew Germany's war was lost. Firepower had been trumped by connection, and pride had given way to resignation. When the war was over and prisoners of war returned home, many carried with them memories not only of defeat, but of the quiet force that had undone them. The radios inside American in conversations with families, in memoirs and in hushed stories over dinner tables, veterans admitted that this hidden advantage had left a deeper impression than any shell or bullet. It was not just a weapon, it was a revelation. Some described how strange it felt to re-enter a Germany where radios were still scarce, expensive, and often out of reach for ordinary people. They recalled the shock of watching Americans treat radios as ordinary tools, scattered across jeeps, trucks, planes, and every Sherman that rolled into battle. The more they reflected, the clearer it became that the Americans had not simply outproduced them in steel, they had mastered the art of communication. For many, this realization reshaped their view of modern war. Tanks were not isolated gladiators, they were parts of a larger organism. Radios were the bloodstream, carrying orders, warnings, and opportunities at a speed Germany could never match. Veterans who had once mocked the Sherman as inferior now spoke of it with reluctant respect. Its armor and gun were less important than the fact that it was never alone. This respect grew over time. Some former soldiers came to see the radio not merely as a tactical edge, but as a symbol of something larger, a culture that valued equipping every soldier, not just the elite, with the tools to be effective. It was a lesson they carried into the uncertain years of rebuilding, a reminder that the unseen can be more decisive than the obvious. In the years that followed, the lesson of American radios grew beyond the memories of former prisoners. Historians, officers, and engineers alike came to see that the war had revealed a deeper truth. Communication defined modern warfare. Steel, armor, and firepower still mattered, but without coordination they were fragments of strength, scattered and vulnerable. Radios had shown that unity of action was worth more than the thickness of a tank's plate. For Germany, this was a painful realization. Its early victories had been built on speed and surprise, but by the time the Allies perfected communication, speed alone was no longer enough. Every German maneuver was countered by American units that moved in concert, as if guided by a single hand. The battlefield had become a web, and radios were the threads that tied it together. This legacy carried into the Cold War and beyond. Militaries across the world recognized that radios and later advanced communication systems were not luxuries but the foundation of strategy. The lesson was not just tactical but philosophical. Empower every unit with the ability to speak, and the whole becomes stronger than the sum of its parts. For the Germans who once mocked the Sherman, this truth was etched into memory. They had laughed at its shape, doubted its power, and dismissed its crews. Yet in the end, they learned that the real strength of America's war machine was invisible. The endless voices crackling across the ether from tank to tank, from ground to sky, had redefined what it meant to fight, and what it meant to win.